May I ask colleagues to take their respective seats? People are still coming, but maybe we should start now because we have a very heavy schedule, and I'm hoping that we could finish exactly 1 o'clock because today is Jummah prayer, so that people who are going for the prayer could go on time. So I would like to have on-time meeting. So once again, dear colleagues, friends, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you back to the United Nations Forum to 70 years after 1948, Lesson to Achieve a Sustainable Peace. Before we proceed, I would like to note that this event will be webcast live via UNTV. The link is on the screen. To reduce the usage of paper documentation related to this forum, and the committee have been put in a virtual folder, and you can all access it by scanning the QR code near the entrance on your phones. We are now already modern, so please utilize all the technology you can. And kindly note that short clips from the documentary titled Voices Across the Divide will be shown at the beginning of each panel. Voices Across the Divide is a powerful documentary and oral history project exploring the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through rarely heard personal stories. Representatives of government, intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations, and United Nations agencies and programs, excellencies, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dian Triansajani. I'm the PR of Indonesia, and I am now speaking on behalf of the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. It's my privilege to once again welcome you to the resumption of this forum to mark 70 years after 1948 and to look what lessons we can learn from the events of this year to achieve a sustainable peace convened under the auspices of our committee. Yesterday, I believe we had the privilege of hearing from a distinguished group of Palestinian, Israeli, and international political figures and experts. And today, we will also have the same privilege. I would like to acknowledge the number of speakers and other participants who have traveled long distances to attend this forum. I would also like to thank those who have joined us live through webcast. Your presence here and interest in this forum is a testimony once again of your commitment to find a just and lasting peace for the Palestinians. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome to the podium. They are now here in the podium, expert panelists and moderator for panel 3. Before we begin, let us all watch a short video clip from the documentary Voices Across the Divide.
Vast majority of the Palestinian 1948 fled their country, or they were forced. And my family was one of them. We thought it's a question of a few weeks. My parents took 2 suitcases with them, and they thought it's going to be a short time. That they never understood that it will be forever. They passed away in a refugee camp in Lebanon called the Baya camp.
Before we left, my mom did 2 things. One thing I didn't see, and one thing, she took my pants down and she put a belt on me, and she put safety pins in the belt. And later on, I knew it was money. She put money in every kid, with every kid. In case he get lost, maybe that money will save him.
My mom, she don't have money. She left everything over there. My father, he said, just 15 days, you're coming back to the same place. Nothing since that day, 61 years ago, nobody back to Jaffa.
We went away for 2 weeks. We thought. We left the Christmas tree. My mother locked up all the drawers she could, everything, and we just left. Went to my aunt with nothing. No money to speak of, nothing.
My father, who was very active against the British mandate, he was one of the few men in his village who actually carried arms and spent most of his time in Jerusalem and in Deir Yassin. My father did not know how to deal with losing the country. He was in the front lines So he decided to leave. I think he couldn't live in the country, having lost the majority of the land.
For my father, in 1948, the Israeli forces come in to the town. And the town, everybody in the town decides to flee. They fled to the neighboring city, which was Nazareth. It's not even 2 miles away.
I think we have seen that short video clips. Now I would like to once again inaugurate with the discussion panel for the day. Our third panel for the forum is entitled Refugees and the Resolution of the Question of Palestine. As one of the most salient outcomes of the event of 1948 was the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their homes, making them refugees, and as they have not until today allowed to return to their homes, the question of Palestine refugees is one of the key issues that need to be addressed and resolved in order to find a solution to the question of Palestine as a whole. We have seen the video clips of some of them, and of course this morning panel will address these very important issues. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Mouin Rabbani, Senior Fellow with the Institute for Palestine Studies and a contributing editor of Middle East Power Report. He previously served as a senior analyst for the International Crisis Group, the Palestine Director of the Palestine American Research Center, a project director for the Association of Netherlands Municipalities in a project to establish the Association of Palestinian Local Authorities, and also a volunteer and general editor for Al-Haq. May I now request Mr. Rabbani to introduce the speaker and moderate the session. You have the floor.
Thank you, Excellency, and good morning. Yesterday we had two very rich panels looking at the past, about what happened in 1948, and then taking stock of the present in terms of the ongoing Nakba. And today this panel will begin looking at the future, specifically at the issue of refugees and the resolution of the question of Palestine. And as His Excellency just said, in 1948 was characterized not only by the Palestinians' loss of their country, but specifically by the experience of uprooting and dispossession and the refugee question, which persists today, 70 years later. I'm very pleased to introduce our four distinguished panelists who will be addressing this issue. Dr. Susan Akram, clinical professor of law at Boston University. Ms. Lubnah Shomali, executive director of the Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights. Ms. Jessica Nevo, the founder of Just in Case, Toolboxes for Justice in Transition, and Ms. Francesca Albanese from the Institute for the Study of International Migration at Georgetown University. I've asked the speakers to speak in alphabetical order, and for each of them to answer a general question, namely, why and how is the Palestine refugee question relevant to the resolution of the question of Palestine as a whole, and to address this question from their specific area of expertise and background. And we will begin with Francesca, who will discuss the relevance of international law to this broader question. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mouin, and good morning, everyone. So in order to frame the discussion of today, let me first precise who are the Palestinian refugees we are talking about today, because it's true we have been referring to them as those who were forced to leave or left between 1947 and 1948-49 in connection with the hostility of the first Israeli-Arab war, and were not allowed to return. But the Palestinian refugee dimension has grown more complex over the time because, as Palestinians often say, the Nakba which started in 1948 never ended, and has occurred again in 1967, and as Badil reports, continue in a silent dimension because Palestinian have continued to be displaced from the remainder of the British Mandate Palestine territory after 1967 and continue to be displaced today, including in secondary and tertiary forms, because Palestinian refugees ended up mostly in Jordan, the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Lebanon and Syria, but from them have moved further afield in other countries in the region and in Europe, America, and in my latest survey of where Palestinian refugees are, today I can see that there are Palestinian refugees in Asia and in Africa, meaning they're exploring new routes of safe haven, where the usual ones are becoming increasingly restrictive. So in order to answer the first question, the panel asks, so what's the relevance of Palestinian refugees within the question, the broader question of Palestine? The relationship is direct and intimate, because in a sense, hadn't there been a Palestine question, there wouldn't be Palestinian refugees. And at the same time, as it's been said, while a certain aspect of the Palestine question, like the territorial dimension of where Palestinians will decide to exercise their jurisdiction, can be, or it's already demonstrated then, can be solved through negotiation, the question of Palestinian refugees still remains a main divisive edge between the Israeli and the Palestinians. And at the same time, it's not possible to envisage a solution to the conflict which doesn't take into account this dimension. Similarly intimate and direct is the relevance of international law to Palestinian refugee and their question, but in a sort of inverse order, because had there been a respect of international law as is stood in 1947-48 and in subsequent years, we wouldn't be talking about Palestinian refugees today. And this is what I would like to start focusing on. What was the status of the law when the Palestinian refugee displacement first occurred? Because as from the first panel yesterday, the message of the first panel was that there were already legal issues with the way the mandate was conceived and implemented, in the sense that there were already issues with how respectful of the principles of self-determination the mandate was, and then the partition plan was, and what happened to the land and to the refugees from 1947 onward constituted a violation of established norm of humanitarian law, because the question of Palestinian refugees stems from a situation of conflict, of armed hostilities, and then it's that framework we need to look at. And if we look at that, it's clear that expulsions and deportations were already considered illegal. Pillaging and looting were already considered prohibited. And the destruction of and seizure of property in the context of hostility constituted crimes. And this was also affirmed as war crimes and crimes against humanity in the aftermath of the Second World War with the Nuremberg trials. Similarly, in Palestinian, those who had been displaced in 1947-48 were to be allowed to return to the land and were to be compensated under law that had been established since the 20s. There was a famous case, the Chorstorf factory, which established that for any illegally, unlawfully taken property, there was an international responsibility to restitute and to compensate for the losses. Again, in 1948, the problem was not with international law framework, but with enforcement of it. And this is something that has remained a pattern of the Palestinian refugee question. The way international law has evolved, the human rights law, humanitarian law framework, And the refugee law framework and stateless framework do confirm that Palestinian refugees are entitled to a broad range of rights and protection. And despite that, besides, not only within the occupied Palestinian territory, wherever they have ended up through their diasporic ties, they've experienced serious limitations to the enjoyment of their rights, both in terms of access to durable solutions and in terms of access, enjoyment of basic rights. The decline of and the enjoyment of socioeconomic rights, for example, that Palestinian refugees have experienced, and the fact that they have often resented tensions between their host countries and the PLO, or simply shifts vis-à-vis the conflict that they are associated with, bear testament to how Palestinian refugees, from an international point of view, are stuck between a rock and a hard place. And applying an international law approach to them today takes into account not only the importance of establishing the right to return and affirming and advancing it, but also recognizing the rights they have under international law framework in each country where they are. I think that I've exhausted my time, and I'm happy to continue in the discussion.
Thank you very much. And what I took away from that particularly is that Palestinian refugee rights are not, let's say, recent additions to international law that are being claimed retroactively, but that the framework, in fact, already existed at the time of the Nakba, and that once again we come up against a problem of the issue being not the legal framework, but rather its enforcement. Our next speaker is Susan Akram, who will be speaking about the relevance of comparative perspectives and particularly the case of Namibia. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I think this is my 5th time before this committee, and sometimes I feel like I'm saying the same thing over and over, and not much change happens in the interim. Here we are 70 years after the Nakba, 30 years after initial UN recognition of Palestine as a state, and already 6 years after granting Palestine non-member observer status. And the question remains, what can Palestinian statehood without self-determination bring Palestinians? Does recognition of Palestinian statehood and non-member status at the United Nations really change anything for the refugees in the absence of territorial independence? I want to address this question by way of a comparison between Palestine and Southwest Africa, Namibia, and what legal strategies were followed and have been followed in both cases at the United Nations. I'm very grateful that the representative from Namibia yesterday raised the Namibia example, as it is both illustrative of differences but instructive of similarities that are very useful for the question of statehood for Palestine. I want to do a very quick historical and legal comparison of these two cases, draw some conclusions, and then raise some questions about what lessons we can draw about the way forward. And I apologize about the truncated version of this. This is actually part of much larger research looking at the Tibetan, Western Sahara, and Palestinian cases using Namibia as a primary case study. So why compare Palestine and the Southwest Africa Namibia cases? Namibia and Palestine had parallel histories in terms of the way that they began their campaigns towards self-determination and independence, and in the way that their status was addressed initially at the League of Nations and then later at the United Nations. Although I can't do an adequate comparison, a brief excursion into some points about these histories is helpful to understand two issues: the different ways in which law provides a framework for attaining statehood, and whether independence is a necessary precondition to statehood. What I want to illustrate is the critical role that legal strategies in the United Nations and elsewhere played in the Namibian bid to statehood in the absence of independence, and how the absence of a clear and sustained legal strategy on the part of the Palestinians has affected their bid for statehood in the absence of independence. And finally, what are the main consequences for Palestinian refugees? The League of Nations Covenant and the Treaty of Lausanne that ended the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I incorporated a plan for decolonization by creating 3 classes of territories, claimed to be at different stages of development, placing them under the supervision or mandates of one or other of the great powers. Palestine was entrusted, as you all know, to Great Britain and placed among the Class A mandates, or those closest to readiness for independence, along with Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and Transjordan. Southwest Africa, Namibia, was among the Class C mandate countries and considered farthest from independence under the League of Nations Covenant. In fact, independence was not contemplated at all by the League for the Class C territories. Namibia, as you also know, was placed under South Africa's mandate. When the League dissolved on April 18, 1946, all the mandate countries continued as trusteeships under the new United Nations, except for Syria, Lebanon, and Transjordan, which had become, by then, independent. South Africa had sought to fully incorporate Namibia as South African territory, but the United Nations refused, and the General Assembly voted to put Namibia under trusteeship under Chapter 12 of the UN Charter. South Africa refused, beginning a lengthy battle in the United Nations. Almost immediately, the General Assembly filed the first of 3 requests for advisory opinions from the International Court of Justice on various questions relating to the status of Namibia. And the Security Council later filed another advisory opinion with the ICJ, and finally, Liberia and Ethiopia filed a contentious case challenging South Africa's apartheid policies and failure to comply with the UN requirements towards South Africa. In October 1962, the UN terminated the South African mandate, placed Namibia under direct UN responsibility, and set up an ad hoc committee for Southwest Africa to recommend the means of administering Southwest Africa to enable the people to exercise self-determination and achieve independence. The General Assembly also established the Namibian Council to administer territory until independence. Although South Africa did not recognize Namibian independence and did not withdraw from the territory until 1988, the world community, following the actions taken at the UN and at the International Court of Justice, had created a defined legal framework for Namibia's status, declared its independence, imposed sanctions on South Africa, and created the mechanisms to implement independence over a period of 20 years before independence was actually achieved. And this was so even though the Security Council never voted to take Chapter 7 enforcement action to enforce South Africa to withdraw from Southwest Africa. Much of these developments occurred through what I call a robust legal strategy involving submissions to the International Court and work within the UN General Assembly from the start. In contrast, Palestine was a Class A mandate and the only state of the Class A territories not to achieve independence by the time the League terminated in 1946. It is true that Britain had incorporated inconsistent provisions into its mandate terms, including on the one hand the covenant commitment to bring Palestine to independence, and on the other the Balfour commitment of securing a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. At the same time, the actual foundation for recognition and the legal framework for Palestinian independence was not developed and to this day has not been developed jointly within the General Assembly and the Security Council. Continuing Palestine as a UN trusteeship territory in 1946 was objected to by the Arab states. Similar to South Africa over Namibia, the UN accepted Britain's commitments under the mandate rather than putting Palestine under direct UN trusteeship. I want to just mention Resolution 194 that was passed in 1948, which is a key resolution incorporating the individual refugee rights of return, restitution, and compensation, and which the UN conditionally accepted Israel in 1949 pending compliance with it. Most relevant here, Resolution 194 incorporated a definition of Palestine refugee as understood by the UN drafters, meaning the entire group of persons who were covered by the British Mandate Palestine Nationality citizenship laws of 1925, emanating from the Lausanne Treaty. These covered all habitual residents and citizens of Palestine defined as such by operation of the Palestine Citizenship Orders, incorporated into the Ottoman Palestine Nationality Law through the Lausanne Treaty, as well as all their descendants. Today, such persons would number approximately 11 million Palestinians worldwide. However, soon after 181 passed, the General Assembly and the Security Council began to act in very different and inconsistent ways towards Palestine, with the General Assembly developing a significant body of resolutions affirming both individual rights of, for example, refugee return, property restitution and compensation, and the collective right of self-determination, statehood, and independence, and has since insisted on this framework as the one for peace negotiations. In contrast, the Security Council's framework has almost exclusively focused on the 242 and 338 basis of a negotiated solution. These two resolutions create the Land for Peace formula that suggests that the only legal framework necessary to resolve the conflict is some exchange of territory for a permanent peace. Most critical, the Security Council has failed to affirm inalienable Palestinian rights, self-determination and statehood, and right of refugee return, and Israeli withdrawal from 67 territories, which have been the focus of the General Assembly's framework. The Security Council's approach, as I mentioned, has been framed by the political Land for Peace formula with almost no reference to legal rights. Let me end with the questions that we have learning from Namibia that need to be answered by a clear legal framework. First, who are Palestinian nationals? Who are Palestinian refugees? And what will be the recognized population to be covered in a just solution? Palestinians in the occupied territory, within Israel, in the diaspora, Palestinian refugees. Since there's no Palestinian nationality citizenship law, are Palestinian refugees only to be defined as the 5 million on the UNRWA rolls, the refugees only in the West Bank and Gaza, or the 11 million global Palestinian population as defined for Resolution 194 and the UN Conciliation Commission? Second, again on questions of consequences, what can Palestine do to enforce territorial integrity in the West Bank and Gaza in the absence of withdrawal of Israel? What can Palestine do to enforce withdrawal of settlements or even implement a uniform legal system in the West Bank and Gaza in the absence of withdrawal of Israel and the backing of the US? None of these issues has been addressed through resolutions or ICJ opinions or other law that could help the rest of the community of states define the legal framework to respond. What the Namibian case showed was that for over 20 years before actual independence, Namibians and their supporters had a strong legal strategy combined with the political and the armed struggle that resolved many of the key issues, allowing the non-rejectionist states to make statehood meaningful by the time actual independence came about. In the absence of such a strategy and a clear body of soft and hard law to support the actions of those countries supporting Palestinian self-determination, the recognition of Palestinian statehood cannot advance the issues that matter most to the Palestinian people: the fulfillment of their rights as refugees to return, to restitution of their properties, as well as their collective rights of full recognition as a people connected with their own land, with all the freedoms such recognition ordinarily brings.
Thank you very much. In an era where it's becoming increasingly common to draw comparisons between Israel and apartheid-era South Africa, I think it's very interesting that a number of scholars are also focusing specifically on the Namibia precedent rather than South Africa. I think you very eloquently spoke to its relevance to the refugee question, and I'm also reminded of the recent book by Norman Finkelstein, published by University of California Press, Gaza, an Inquest into Its Martyrdom, and the appendix to which demonstrates how the Namibia precedent can also be utilized to demonstrate that the occupation can already be declared illegal, and it was a work that was highly praised by John Dugard, the former UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territory, and also utilized by his successor, Michael Link, in his recent presentation at the end of last year. So thank you very much for that. Our next speaker is Jessica Nevo, who will speak on the relevance of transitional justice and its relevance to the refugee question and a resolution of the question of Palestine. The floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you for this invitation. We could ask how the refugee question could be not relevant to the resolution of the Palestinian problem. I will refer to the transitional justice model as a paradigm that was developed in the last 30 years. I will explain the title of the initiative. Together with other colleagues, we are developing Just in Case, Toolboxes for Justice in Transition. I will explain what we can do just in case that things were developing. And I would like to see the issue of the return of the refugees from the transitional justice perspective and try to ask who is responsible in the Israeli society to talk about return. We referred yesterday to the issue of settler colonialism. Professor Ilan Pape referred to the issue of settler colonialism, and there is already criticism from the settler colonialism perspectives on transitional justice. I would like to refer on that, and I would like to take the one of the issues that are analyzed under settler colonialism, the issue of elimination, how cultures, languages, and societies are eliminated. This is one of the main concepts of Patrick Wolf. And I would like to analyze that and referring to the march of return. I will finish with the recommendations. Maybe I won't have time in the first round. Recommendations for this committee, recommendations for the UN, and recommendations for my colleagues in the left and human rights movement. That some of them were yesterday and they're not here today. I would like to refer to my personal experience living under a military dictatorship in Argentina in the 70s and the 80s. And this experience of that people were marked and named as traitors only because we dared to ask questions. We challenge the censorship. We challenge the books that we are supposed to put away from our houses. And we know that when a group of people are named traitors, one of the mechanisms to deal with that could be the issue of erasure and elimination. Unfortunately, in Argentina and in other countries in the south, like in Chile and Uruguay, the elimination was physical elimination. People were disappeared. And I would like to say what it means today to talk about the Nakba and the occupation of 1967, to talk about Israel as selling arms to all the countries, to talk about who is profiting from the occupation. My colleagues here are sitting with me on the right. And in Israel, everyone who is dealing with this issue, people working and activists in Zochrot, in the Coalition of Women for Peace, in Who Profits, we are named traitors. And we cross the line of consensus, and There are several artists and actors. Maybe you know about Einat Weizmann, people who are banned from doing their art. Of course, there is a Palestinian poet, Darin Tatur, that she's now in jail for writing a poem in Facebook. And in this perspective, we have to see how the mechanism of elimination that started in the Nakba, eliminating the villages, erasing the language, and how these mechanisms could be challenged by the transitional justice perspective. I will explain now what is it, but I want to say that the March of Return is a reminder for us, is a reminder for Israeli public what people want to forget because it doesn't exist. If Palestinians don't exist and they are less than human, there is nothing we have to do to acknowledge, to take responsibility because they were completely eliminated from our awareness. And the March of Return came as a proof that doesn't matter how much efforts Israeli governments and Israeli society is trying to erase the existence of the Nakba and the Palestinians, is coming back again and again because what transitional justice says, until you don't heal the trauma on what you did, there is no way to go forward. The transitional justice model takes into consideration the set of tools and mechanisms that individual societies and governments are implementing in order to help a political transition, in order to do the transition as much soft as possible. But what is, we have the official version of transitional justice as was mainly developed in Argentina after the dictatorship, in Chile when the first Truth and Reconciliation Commission was named in this way. We know, of course, South Africa, but what is interesting that the transitional justice practices are proven as efficient even in situations when there is no political transition as we know it, what we call non-transitional settings. And this is referring to Canada, Australia, the US, when people are taking awareness of the impact of settler colonialism, even when on slavery. We are talking about how the African-American community in the US, in the Caribbean, are talking about demanding acknowledgement and reparations on slavery. In Haiti are demanding from France. And what I would like to develop later is how in the context of Israel and Palestine, the transitional justice model could be developed in a pre-transitional justice, and what would be the tools that I would like to invite all of you and all the communities to engage in a process, not to say what we have to do and to complain that it is not done, but how to start from the end. What are the tools we can start to do and be prepared just in case the refugees are returned, just in case there is a transition and we have to give answers.
Thank you very much, and also particularly, I think, for tying in your personal experience in Argentina and going from that to broader principles of transitional justice and tying that also into what's happening right now in terms of the Great March of Return. Thank you. And our last panelist, final panelist, last but not least, is Lubnah Shomali, who will speak on the relevance of reparations and the role and responsibility of the international community with respect to a resolution of the Palestine refugee question and more broadly the question of Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you, Mouin, and
the other panelists for very interesting interventions. When we talk about the refugee or IDP condition, we recognize within the frameworks of international law that it's created by the commission of human rights violations by states or other actors against people under its own jurisdiction, and or the failure of those states to ensure national protection, which then thus leads to the displacement and dispossession and the transfer of these people. Within the case of Palestine, we're talking about not only the displacement and the transfer, but also the continued denial to seek effective remedies and just reparations, which are very established norms or principles within international law. So why go to a reparations mechanism? Why would a reparations mechanism be required with regards to the question of Palestine, and specifically with regards to the question of Palestinian refugees? In my talk or in my intervention, I'm going to talk about the need for reparations and how it can be a mechanism to achieve durable solutions and lasting sustainable peace. I'm also going to look at what reparations looks like in principle within international law, as well as what it should look like in practice, and then also take into consideration what is perceived or put forth by Israel and Israeli allies, what are considered obstacles to the implementation of the right of return and reparations for Palestinian refugees and IDPs. So why is reparations a mechanism or a reparations that is required? Not just in the case of Palestinian refugees, but also in other refugee and displacement and dispossession situations. Reparations was incorporated into international law as a mechanism of deterrence to prevent states from taking actions that both domestically and internationally, with international armed conflicts, from creating situations that would lead to the creation of refugee and IDP communities. So it was intended to prevent or to avoid the refugee or IDP condition. It was also created in order to, on the principle of equity, so that countries are not benefiting from or profiting from the violation of rights of others, whether under their jurisdiction or outside their jurisdiction. Reparations, of course, is a mechanism that serves to repair the individual or group dignity that is lost in situations of displacement and dispossession. So it serves as a means of achieving justice. And using a reparations mechanism also reduces the financial burdens, particularly on the international community and the victims of displacement and dispossession. Finally, reparations is part of a broader range of restorative measures. Jessica was talking about transitional justice and potential mechanisms that could be used. Yesterday, Ilan Pape was talking about the 3 A's, acknowledgement, accountability, and acceptance. Other restorative measures would include apologies, as well as reforming political and social institutions. So what does effective remedies and just reparations for Palestinian refugees and IDPs look like? According to international law and the International Court of Justice, reparations must, as far as possible, wipe out the consequences of the illegal act and reestablish the situation which would, in all probability, have existed if the act had not been committed. So, what are the components when we're looking at reparations in principle? We're looking, of course, at voluntary repatriation or return, physical return of refugees and IDPs. and I'd like to stress that the key word is voluntary. We're looking at property restitution, the reclamation of the original property lost whenever possible. We're also looking at compensation, whether it's monetary or other property, for damages to both movable and immovable property, and in addition to any benefits that were gained by the perpetrator of the illegal act. And finally, the fourth component, of course, is satisfaction, victim satisfaction, including guarantees of non-repetition. Now, successful reparations packages have included or should include all four components: repatriation, property restitution, compensation, and guarantees of non-repetition. So it's not about this or that of the reparations mechanism. It's not return, and then if there's no return, then you can't reclaim your property. That's not how it works. It's a combination of different variations of all four of the components of the reparations mechanism. Wow. Okay, in practice, what does a successful reparations process look like? Or what do we need in order to have a very successful reparations mechanisms? Well, we need a detailed political agreement, one that has basically three components: one that is grounded in international law and human rights and ensures the individual rights of the people involved, particularly in this case, Palestinian refugees and IDPs. One that repeals or amends existing discriminatory legislation, policies, and practices. And, of course, it needs to contain an enforcement mechanisms to be able to enforce the agreement. In other words, the main components that Oslo is lacking. There also needs to be participation of rights holders, especially the victims, and here we're referring to Palestinian refugees and IDPs. Of course, such a mechanism is going to need international support and political backing. We have to have comprehensive legislative framework with a review mechanism and a system of return and restitution grounded in the rule of law, and the equitable distribution of the land. Of course, restitution should be favored over pure compensation because it's more financially viable, it eliminates racially biased spatial segregation, and it restores dignity or provides the highest sense of justice. I will hold off there, even though I have a little bit more to say, but I'd be happy to take questions within the session. Thank you.
Thank you. If you could turn off the mic, please. Thank you very much. So if I understand correctly, do the exact opposite of everything that's been done in the past 70 years, and the issue is solved. Thank you. Before opening up to the floor, I'd like to ask the panelists if any of them have questions for others. But before doing so, I'd like to interject with two brief questions. The first is for Lubnah. You provided a very detailed framework for reparations, but I'd be interested if you could just very briefly focus on the role of the international community in addressing this issue. And for Susan, I had another question. You indicated that on account of time constraints, you were only able to discuss the Namibia example, but if at all possible, to just also briefly explain why these other cases that you're looking at are relevant in this context as well. So, Lubnah, if you would, please.
Okay. Basically, we're talking about the failure of a particular state, in this sense Israel, to provide protection to people under its jurisdiction. whether we're talking about Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, whether we're talking about Palestinians in the occupied territory of 1967, which Israel has exercised effective control through the occupation, or whether we're talking about the Palestinians who were forced into exile out of mandatory Palestine into the surrounding countries. So ensuring this protection of persons who are in need of it becomes an international responsibility when the state in question is unwilling or unable to provide that protection. So it becomes incumbent on third-party states, the UN and its various bodies, to intervene in order to provide this protection. And it's not just protection through providing humanitarian aid and assistance or development in order to be able to meet the basic needs of this population, but it also requires that they ensure that their most fundamental rights are met. And this is the subject that Francesca was alluding to, that during the period of their refugee or IDP status, it is incumbent that these vulnerable individuals and communities, the Palestinian refugees and internally displaced, have access to their most basic fundamental rights: education, health care, sanitation, adequate housing, adequate standard of living, and so on and so forth. And then also it is incumbent on the international community to provide more effective protection in terms of supporting, guaranteeing, and ensuring the right to remedy and the access to justice through the right to reparations.
Thank you. Thank you. Susan?
Yes, so I'll start with the second question. Just very briefly, the three most protracted refugee situations in the world are the Sahrawi, the Tibetans, and the Palestinians. So my research inquiry was to see how the successful Namibia use of UN mechanisms might be instructive in all these three cases. And they all three have very different sort of histories and trajectories within the UN. For example, Tibet has only 3 UN resolutions and only one that says anything about self-determination. Western Sahara, basically the issue was moved from the United Nations to the Arab League and has stalemated at the Arab League. So the question is how to bring that back into the larger UN framework. But in particular, what has been the use of the International Court of Justice in these cases? And what has been the use of the UN human rights mechanisms in these cases? And that's a more complicated question than I can answer here, but I have a chapter in a book called Still Waiting for Tomorrow that does all the work, so I refer you there.
Thank you, and very much looking forward to it. I'd now like to invite panelists, if any of them have questions for colleagues. Please, Lubnah.
I would just like to ask Jessica if she could very briefly talk about some of the transitional justice mechanisms and how they could be applied in the case of Palestine.
Please.
Yeah, we can say that many things that were mentioned in these 2 days, also the 3 A's and the different ways of acknowledgement, they can all be wrapped under transitional justice. This is a suggestion for a kind of paradigm shift to try to think differently. I will explain the mechanism, but I would like to say I will introduce my recommendation maybe for the UN institutions. I don't know if you know there is a special rapporteur on transitional justice, and that it's called a very long name, a special rapporteur on the right of truth, justice, reparations, and non-recurrence. So these are all the elements we need to repair. And I understand the rapporteur on human rights is the main tool that is used in this committee and in general, and maybe we can try to think if to integrate the wording of transitional justice that may help. There are main four mechanisms. One of them is truth-seeking mechanisms, dealing with the past. And the main and most famous mechanism we know are truth commissions, all kind of tribunals, public hearings. There are safe spaces for victims and perpetrators and collaborators and what we call bystanders, that people that we are witness to what is going on, but we don't act. And generally, truth commissions use archives. And I'm very interested in the project of oral history, the testimonies of the Palestinian refugees. I would like to mention that all around the world, in transitional justice processes and also in Israel-Palestine, we collect testimonies from perpetrators, from Israeli soldiers, also from 90-year-old fighters that were in the Palmach, and they were fighting for the existence of Israel. And some of them, they have a shift in their awareness, what I call a transitional process of awareness, and they say, we obey orders, and there are some things we were not supposed to do, we expel. So there are all kinds of ways of acknowledgement that can be also on the personal basis. The general second mechanisms is relating to remedies, that reparations is one of them, return, and of course public apologies. And I would like to say that in the situation we are in Israel-Palestine, we can't wait until someone will do. And in cases that governments are not doing, and we have other examples like Guatemala, that if there is a truth commission, an official process that it's not good for the people, people do unofficial processes. And I can refer that in Zochrot, we have done a pilot truth commission on the Nakba in the Nakab, what happened from 48 to 60. We have different kind of apologies, unofficial apologies for displaced people. In the last March of Return in Israel, Eitan Bronstein, who was one of the founders of Zochrot, he said, how we Israelis, how can we apologize in the name of what happened? There are other two mechanisms that also Lubnah referred, institutional reforms. If we don't reform the army or the police or the courts or the educational system, we won't have a way to have a transition. And the last one is related to prosecutions and legal tools. Thank you.
Thank you. If there are no further questions from panelists to each other, you have, please.
I have to for Francesca. Could you clarify this issue that Palestinian refugees have a special status of being refugees, that only for Palestinians it goes from one generation to the others, and that's the reason there is UNRWA and UN, all this specialty that maybe it's not right and has to be clarified.
Thank you, Jessica. Actually, it's a very important question, and I'm glad you raised it, because there is still quite a bit of misunderstanding and misconception about the status of Palestinian refugees in international law, and they have been approached because of it with a certain exceptionalism that have resulted in isolating them and considering them as a special category within the non-realm of international law. In fact, first of all, let me clarify that they are not exceptional in the way they are considered refugee over a protracted period of time, because this is related to the fact that they are protracted refugee under international law, and like any other refugees, like those Susan was mentioning, until an individual refugee or refugees as a group do not achieve a durable solution to their status, to their refugee status, they remain refugees, and so their children. So there is nothing exceptional about that in the situation of Palestinian refugees. Again, this is not something that relates to UNRWA or their status under international law. There is, however, a sort of special status that they enjoy under international law, because they are the only group of refugees which are specifically referred to, even if not mentioned, in the Refugee Convention. In fact, the Refugee Convention 1951, Article 1D, refers to a special group of refugees who are already receiving assistance or protection from other UN agencies. And despite the legal or the triennial debate that has occurred, there were no other refugees that the travaux préparatoires confirmed that there were no other refugees other than the Palestinian ones that were referred in this norm. And the reason why there was this exceptionality back then was not necessarily to create a special status, but because when the convention was adopted, the Palestinian refugee issue was high on the international agenda. There was concern, there was the need to resolve promptly the Palestinian refugee question. And there was clearly no idea that the question would have lasted 70 years. This is why, especially because there were the Arab representatives in the General Assembly who wanted to maintain heightened attention on the question of refugees. They wanted to reconfirm that it was addressed and felt like a UN responsibility and dealt with promptly. They didn't want it to become one of the endless refugee crises within the realm of UNHCR mandate, as it would have evolved. I mean, within a broader framework of refugee law, they insisted to have this provision. At the same time, and this is why there is UNRWA, and there was back then the UNCCP, like the two special bodies mandated to deal with Palestinian refugees. Over the time, and with the lack of resolution of their situation, there has been a sort of rapprochement of UNRWA and UNHCR in the way they deal with Palestinian refugees to ensure a continuity of protection. And I will stop here saying that unfortunately the norm has been misunderstood to a large extent, but in recent years UNHCR and UNRWA have worked together to make sure that there was no exceptionality in treatment of the Palestinian refugees, and they were considered already established refugees under international law, wherever they are.
Thank you. I'd now like to open the session to the floor. If there are any questions or comments, and I would request that you keep them brief, please. Someone here? Sorry, where? Over there. Yeah.
I want to address the question to, am I not audible? No? Yes. What's the issue? Now I'm audible? Okay. Do I start from the beginning? James Thacker, I've worked with 10 human rights groups back into the Soviet period and was involved with the Vanunu case in the Supreme Court, so I've seen a lot of legal systems and implementations. I'd like to ask you, Susan, you mentioned the implementation of mandate and whatever. As late as 31-32, the Jewish Agency had instructions to all Jewish people not to talk about a Jewish state because it was not in the legal framework. And despite Avraham Zwerg's comment yesterday, Israel has never been properly ratified. As an American, I feel very concerned about this. I think Israel also has to move forward in this situation. And I'd like to ask you, because you talked about this implementation question, how does the Jewish, Americans did not actually properly ratify him, and this was admitted to me by Edward Luttwak in a conversation I had with him. It was seized by force majeure. Now, if we were to move forward, we have to include Israel in this. What level of ratification do you feel they've reached, if there is any, to what proportion, and what further ratification? I mean, do we need a constitutional Congress to properly ratify Israel? I think this is part of these two people have to talk to each other legally, and so there has to be a forward movement from both sides.
So I think the question is really about nationality. And there's a misunderstanding about Jewish nationality versus Palestinian nationality. Palestinian nationality emanates, as I mentioned very briefly, from the Lausanne Treaty of 1924. From an international law point of view, Palestinian nationality was established on that date. And the Palestinians who were covered were all of the people covered as Palestine nationals under the Ottoman. It was a grandfathered provision from the Ottoman law, Ottoman citizenship law. So every Palestinian today who traces him or her ancestors to the people covered by the 1924 Lausanne Treaty remain Palestinians as a matter of international law. So that's the sort of background. Now the question becomes, what happened to Palestinian nationality as a result of the Balfour Declaration, Resolution 181, and Resolution 194? Those are the three main instruments that have an effect on the international legal status of Palestinians. Then we have the 1952 Israeli citizenship nationality law, which in its language denationalized all Palestinians who were recognized as a matter of that 1924 legislation, which the British then codified in the mandate citizenship orders. Okay, so at the time of the mandate, something like 70,000 Palestinians got passports as Palestinian citizens of Mandate Palestine. And that all related to that 1924 recognition of Palestinian nationality. So in short, Balfour 181 and 194 did not disturb the international legal status of Palestinians as nationals of Palestine. Did not disturb that from an international point of view. Now the question is, what happened? What's the effect of Israeli domestic legislation that purported to denationalize those Palestinians? From an international law point of view, such legislation is illegal because it is an arbitrary deprivation of national status on the basis of single race, religion, or nationality. Right? That's prohibited, and we have that codified most recently in the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. But it is a matter of customary international law. So that's on the one side. On the other side, you have the claim of Jewish nationality. Resolution 181 recognizes or resolves to allow, the General Assembly has no power to divide territory, so this was simply a resolution, that a resolution of the political question in Palestine was to create two states, and they were called a Jewish and an Arab state, but it's important to actually read the provisions of 181 very carefully, because the preconditions of establishing these two states were UN supervision over two constitutions, and the constitutions on each side had to guarantee equal rights for all of the people living in both territories. Resolution 181 nowhere in its language gives authorization to a Jewish national status. That is, nationality on the basis of religion. So on the one hand, we have the claim to Jewish nationality, but we have no international legal authorization for such a recognition. There is international legal recognition for an Israeli state with equal rights. That's what Resolution 181 provides. On the other hand, we have Palestinian nationality coming from 1924, which one can today call either de facto or de jure nationality, depending on the position that you take about the Israeli law of 1952.
Thank you. Fateh?
Thank you very much. One thing I might add to what Susan was saying that's interesting to think about is that in the after the Lausanne Treaty and even the mandate nationality law of 1925, it did not distinguish Palestinians as Jews, Arab, Muslim, Christian, etc. The idea was everyone who is Palestinian is one who lives in Palestine and is part of that community. But I wanted to address a couple of thoughts to Jessica, and I think that's a really interesting and important effort. And I had kind of tried to get something like that started more than 20 years ago, and it got nowhere because it met up with a couple of obstacles or issues that I'd be interested to know how you're thinking about them. One is the idea that you can really only engage in a transitional justice process once a conflict is ended, or once some kind of transition towards democratization from a situation of repression has happened, then you can start looking at, turning the page. You cannot really turn the page without reading it, so you have to acknowledge and accept and then go proceed towards future. But in this situation, the elements of that need transitional justice are being created every day, with the ongoing Nakba, as we've been talking about, with new measures and new repressions and just in Gaza the last last few weeks is an example. So you're creating material for transitional justice on a daily basis. So it's a kind of a funny conundrum. The other question is that constant tension that you find in all transitional justice processes, which is, are we talking about transitional justice for the purpose of peace and reconciliation, or are we talking about transitional justice for the purpose of justice and accountability? And I think you find, the different examples around the world have almost always shifted towards the former. And it's really, in my mind, only the South African model that has tried to balance both a little bit, so that it looked at levels of crimes, where at certain lighter or the lower levels of crimes, a simple acknowledgement and acceptance and a forgiveness process takes care of it, whereas higher levels of crimes require a judicial process and a retributive justice kind of process. That's a very difficult one to negotiate in the Israeli-Palestinian case, especially as these crimes are ongoing. But I think it's important to note that instead of that, the possibility, I should say, that I think you're trying to work on, of looking at transitional justice processes, whichever way you're deciding to go with it, as a way of peacemaking, rather than as a way of achieving, after the fact justice or after the fact forgiveness. But and there your reference to the oral histories and the documentation, all of that is really important to look at as a process for the future, rather than looking backwards in order to turn pages. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. You are marking the main problems and challenges. And exactly, and what you are saying, these initiatives I have of just in case, the idea is to have like let's think, I don't know, in 30 years, 50 years, I don't know, let's have boxes of all these mechanisms prepared. Let's see how I'm less connected to the Truth Commission wording, and of course the Truth and Commission reconciliation, because all the complexity, and there is a lot of critique on the reconciliation. Yeah, let's hug together and we are friends. Let's reconcile. So this is not a wording we use in Israel-Palestine so far. I'm more thinking about a kind of commission of historical clarification, that it was part of the wording that was used in Guatemala, process of transition. I would see how all the elements, the testimonies, the archives, the apologies, how maybe we can imagine how a text of a public apology of Israelis would be, how civil society, as I say, we can't wait, so let's do something to push the transition. So in a way, it could be what you say, a peace building, but we can say that unofficial processes could be a precursor, or sometimes could be a replacement. Of course, when there is an official transition, like in Argentina or in South Africa, the new regime is in charge of doing the process, because we are not waiting the Israeli government to do that. So we are saying, okay, this could look like this. Apologies, let's try to elaborate a public apology ceremony. There were a group of people thinking with me that knew that I was coming here. We were thinking, okay, let's take some space and do something. Then we said, let's have a video together that Israelis say, not in my name, in a way. And of course, unfortunately, the ongoing Nakba and the intractable nature of the conflict, it gives us material to continue and to continue. But I say it could be a paralysis. We say it's so complicated, let's do nothing. So our suggestion is let's prepare the tools and let's have them and let's play with them.
Thank you. Please.
I would say that I totally agree with Jessica, that we don't have to wait for a viable political agreement or a solution to occur before we start talking about and planning for reparations. And one of the things that Badil and Zukhrot have done, along with other Palestinian and international organizations, is tried to take a comparative analysis of return mechanisms that have been put in practice. So we made missions comparative to what Professor Susan Akram was talking about, to Cyprus, former Yugoslavia, former apartheid South Africa, to take a look at how those reparations mechanisms were put in place, how they were implemented, what was good about them, what was bad about them, what worked, what didn't work, what could be comparable to the Palestinian situation and what could not. And so we have an ongoing project which we have called Practicalities of Return, in which we take a look at what return should look like when return is implemented. And this is something that we've also taken to Palestinian refugee and IDP youth in Palestine, and also recently last winter in Lebanon. So taking these frameworks, throwing them out there or passing on this information to Palestinian refugees and IDPs and asking them, what would you want a reparations mechanism to look like? What would be, for example, the characteristics of the durable solutions that you're looking for? And how can we achieve this within the context of Palestine and Israel? So I totally agree that we don't need to sit around and wait, that this is something that we can start working on, researching, planning for, looking at best practices, and seeing what would work best in the case of Palestine.
Yeah, please.
I have a question for Jessica, just in reference with this last comment about the initiatives that have started. I'm curious to hear what's the response you receive at the level of normal civil society in Israel, and what are the challenges and opportunities that you see there. And probably one comment that I would like to make to what Lubnah just stated. you mentioned cases like Cyprus, and there are plenty of conflicts where return has been implemented. There are plenty of conflicts where Resolution 194 has become like a modus operandi to resolve the refugee crisis. And it's interesting that it has become like a paradigm to resolve the refugee situations where it has been ineffective exactly in the case where it was suggested. And what has been missing, if we think of Timor-Leste, if we think of Iraq, Afghanistan, in all the other cases where massive refugee crises were resolved through return, mostly through return, was significant was the shift in the political will and the pressure that the international community exerted through the UN Security Council. Because in all these cases, the UN Security Council acted under Chapter 6 or Chapter 7 so as to recommend the return. And so there was an orchestrated plan for it to happen, which is what is missing here. So just this comment, and then I'd like to hear, yes, what's happening to these proposals within the Israeli society.
Thank you. We have been talking also in the NGO consultation and about Zochrot, the only Israeli NGO that its aim to educate on the Nakba, to challenge the elimination of the words on the Nakba, to talk to Israelis. And in the wording of transitional justice didn't exist when Zochrot was created around 2001. That was the same year that the International Center for Transitional Justice was created in New York as a main platform that gathers the whole information. But the moment I started to be involved in Zochrot, I worked there several years, all the mechanisms fit with the mechanisms of transitional justice because people and communities, we all have the same needs. We have the needs for acknowledgement, to go to a destroyed village and to put a sign saying this is the name of Lubnah, that was the mosque, here was the water, the hospital. And we can say that Israeli society, the mainstream, they were forced to acknowledge at least what is the Nakba, you know. Now, 10 years ago, it was impossible that people didn't know, and we can say that the last 6 weeks of the March of Return, Israelis have to deal with the existence of Palestinians. In general, I can say the reaction is you are traitors, yeah, you are self-hate Jews, you are anti-Semites. But I would like to mark another problem, not a problem, a challenge, that let's say Israeli society is a big challenge, but the Israeli left and the human rights community in Israel, that most of it are working on the issue of the 1967 occupation, it's very difficult to work with the left on issues of the Nakba and the right of return. And one of the questions I mentioned, I would like as a wish, as a demand, what is the role of left people, leaders, even people who were in politics, in the governments, how the Israeli left is, you know, if it's not the left and the human rights communities, who is going to talk about return and about the Nakba? So this is a work of outreach that sometimes is more challenging than doing an event for the general public.
Francesca, what you said, of course, that there is a lack of political will, and there has been a significant lack of political will to see reparations through for Palestinian refugees. But I think there's also something that can be gained from looking at the different mechanisms and the strengths and weaknesses of different mechanisms. Like, for example, in former Yugoslavia, they had a very high repatriation rate, one of the highest ever. And property restitution as well. But unfortunately, there wasn't enough invested by the international community in terms of reconstruction and rebuilding and reintegrating returnees, especially into the economies and into the community. So what ended up happening was many of the refugees, there wasn't sustainable return. They ended up selling off their lands and their properties and going elsewhere. In terms of former apartheid South Africa, there was such a focus on individual right to restitution, property restitution, and so on and so forth, that it became, and to this day still is, a very cumbersome judicial process where they have to very stringently make sure that they're not violating or they are receiving the property restitution. And just one final comment with regards to Palestine, because it is a highly protracted conflict and highly protracted situation of displacement. You have, let's say, a village like, for example, Beit Natif or whatever, one of the small villages, and the people that were originally displaced from that village number, let's say, 1,000 or 900. But now you're talking about those individuals potentially and their descendants, second, third, and fourth generation. So now maybe we're talking about, let's say, 15,000 people. How do we equitably redistribute the land in such a way that makes it economically viable and restores the dignity? So these are things, I'm not saying that we have all the answers, because as Susan said, there are lots of questions still. But there are certain lessons that we can learn from previous return situations and reparations situations.
Thank you. I see a lot of green lights, so I'm going to take several questions before asking the panelists to respond. I'll start in the back there, Jabir, please. And please, if I could ask people to try to keep their questions or comments brief and pointed. Thank you.
Given that the focus of this panel is the refugees and the resolution of the question of Palestine, I'm wondering if one of the panelists can highlight the current crucial crisis of UNRWA and its ambiguous future. That we no doubt that targeting UNRWA constitutes some sort of a threat to the right of return, as a resolution 302, which established UNRWA, emphasized that UNRWA should implement its mandate without any prejudice to paragraph 11 of 194. My question, what are the possible scenarios for the future of UNRWA, taking into account the sinister plans prepared by USA and Israel against UNRWA? More specifically, is paralyzing the role of UNRWA and rendering it to face the same fate that has been faced by the UNCCP, which stopped seeking for political solution by the end of 1951 or the beginning of 1952. So is this one of the possible scenarios, that paralyzing UNRWA and rendering it as acting as the UNCCP, which is still existing but not acting, doing not active role in seeking a political solution for the Palestinian refugees? This is my question to any of the speakers.
Thank you. Ambassador Mansour.
Thank you very much. Again, also, I want, to thank all the panelists, for sharing, very important ideas with us. And, of course, the committee and my friend, Johnny, for introducing the panel. I have some comments related to what my good friend Susan Akram has said, and also few issues related to UNRWA and its history. Not UNRWA, the refugees. Now, with regard, to the narrative that Susan gave us, unless it is more extensive in your book, because we cannot jump from the mandate, and before that, Balfour Declaration, and in the mandate, a key element to implement the Balfour Declaration for establishing a Jewish homeland, and for the fact that it was intentional, in my opinion, that the UK did not give Palestine independence, although it was under bracket A, because at that time it would not have guaranteed the establishment of a Jewish homeland. So then it was designed to have the partition plan that at least it will allow for the establishment of a Jewish state or Israel. I don't want to discuss, although it needs to be discussed, of the reality at that time within our movement, the Palestinians, and the Arab situation, in which a minority faction within our movement was calling for establishing a Palestinian state in accordance with the partition. Had that was done, then things could have been completely different. But then, you know, you cannot just skip from that moment and 1952 to, let's say, the 70s, 80s, 90s realities, because from that moment on, the Palestinians were not in control of their destiny. It was the Arab countries who were dealing with the issue at the United Nations as a refugee issue. And at best, although that they had the armistice line in 1949, but, you know, they were calling for the implementation of 194, and they did not succeed in its implementation during all this period. Now, I say that in terms of putting things in perspective, because, you know, that the main thrust of your presentation is that the legal framework of Namibia and the lessons from it is not being utilized by the Palestinian side, which, in my opinion, I don't think that that is a fair assessment for two reasons. The first reason, that you cannot compare apples and oranges to begin with. Secondly, the main element that was introduced to us to benefit from the Namibian legal framework was to go to the ICJ with another advisory opinion on the prolongation of occupation, which I said that from the time of Dugard through the time of Link, we are seriously studying it and considering it seriously in order really to see how that, to be added to our legal framework, can truly advance our situation. But in the case of Namibia, or in our case, the legal framework is only one component of the struggle that led, in their case, to the success of their independence. In our case, it is still being used along with other available options to us, whether in the Security Council or in the General Assembly or in the Council of Human Rights, and also the legal option, which I think that you have to add to your discussion and discourse, that one of the important ramifications of changing our status to an observer state, it's allowing us to be a member to the ICC. And you cannot dismiss that that is irrelevant, you know, while many of you were hammering us before that. Join the ICC, join the ICC. When we join the ICC, you are quiet. We are trying to maximize our benefit from the legal option along with other options. Let me also add, in 1974, when we came back to the UN as the PLO, one should analyze one important resolution, one of the first resolutions that we've adopted, which is 3236, which reaffirmed our inalienable rights to self-determination, to statehood, and to the implementation of Resolution 194, meaning the right of the refugees. And from that moment on, we started legislating details related to the rights of the Palestinian people in the General Assembly, way much more than the Namibian experience. That also had to be added to the narrative, because, you know, you cannot, our situation, and there's, although it might have some similarities, but we have significant differences. Again, we are very grateful to many of our friends, and you are among them, who are telling us about different options that we should utilize in the legal framework. But again, from you, from all of my other friends in the legal front, basically what they are telling us is to go again to the General Assembly with another advisory opinion on the prolongation of occupation. And we are seriously considering it. It is not that easy. Maybe it's easy to articulate it, but to implement it, then you need to deal with a host of many issues related to the reality in the General Assembly, related, to the composition of judges in the ICJ, and so on and so forth. So this is what I just wanted to share with you, and I'm looking forward to your book, and I'm looking also forward to be as comprehensive as possible, because it is not fair to show or to insinuate that in Namibia they were brilliant and they used it and they got independence, and on the Palestinian side that we are not shouldering our responsibility, because that is not the case. At least it's not the case here at the United Nations. And
Thank you.
Know that well. The other thing, quickly, with regard to refugees, one of the amazing things in our case, which, the establishment of UNRWA and 194 were unique things in the history of the United Nations. When UNRWA was established, it was the first agency that dealt with refugees that was restricted only in dealing with services and deprived of providing protection. Because all agencies related to refugees, they have the dual responsibilities of providing protection for the refugees and providing with services. And in the discussion in the history of the UN, they said that the UNCCP was responsible for the protection and UNRWA was responsible for the services. When the UNCCP, more or less in the early 50s, finished its business, they kept with them the protection. And I remember during the time of Karen of Abu Zaid, and we have some friends from UNRWA here, she was outraged. They said, I will not accept anymore to provide services without rendering, protection. And she began the process, which I think it's important for those who are trying to document the history of UNRWA and the refugee question related to the Palestinian people, to dwell on the fact that UNRWA cannot provide services without providing protection. And in many of the wars in Gaza, people went to the facilities of UNRWA because of the flag of the UN, and in a way it provided functional protection to the hundreds of thousands who went to seek protection there. So I think that issue needs to be re-examined, to give UNRWA what belongs to it, which is to provide protection. In that connection, as we speak, we are negotiating a draft resolution in the Security Council on providing international protection for the civilian population, because Israel abdicated its responsibility with regard to protection under international humanitarian law. And if that is the situation, then the international community has to step in and to be involved in providing protection.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll take a few more. All the way in the back, please. Yes. Is it you or the person behind you? I think it's you. Okay, please go ahead.
No. Okay. Ms. Albanese spoke on the lack of access to enjoyment of rights for Palestinians living in the diaspora. And I experienced this firsthand when visiting the Baqa refugee camp in Jordan. But I was also aware that they discourage a lot of aid because they're fearful that it will make the camps more permanent. So how are we supposed to make the lives of these people better until we have a right of return, when they're scared that a lot of these options are going to make the camps permanent and get in the way of their option of right of return?
Thank you. And I actually intended to call to the person on your right. So Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. This is for Ms. Lubnah. On the question of reparations, I was wondering, what's the time frame you believe that reparations will be done for the Palestinians if peace comes? Just because, for example, in the United States, Jessica mentioned this, how Native Americans, African Americans had similar reparations, even though they never came to 100%, but we did eventually have reparations after slavery and colonization. And it seems as if for a majority of countries it takes a very long time for reparations to go full force and for it to be effective for all people. So is there a time frame or a clear process as to how all Palestinians will eventually get reparations when peace does come?
Thank you. So I'd now like to give the panelists the opportunity to briefly respond. Susan, you first, please.
Yes, Ambassador Mansour exceeded my expectations in his response. I knew it was coming. And I by no means excluded in my notes and the research the steps that the PLO has taken, including the ICC. Of course, we're tracking all of the advances. And I'm sorry that it came across as though sort of that there is a massive deficiency and everyone should be following the Namibia example. The way that I've done the research is to extract what lessons can be extracted from the Namibia case, but also illustrating the differences in each of these cases. So I had a 0 minutes sheet before I was about halfway through the notes that I have. Obviously, this research is much more dense than I can do justice to in 7 or 8 minutes. By no means do I mean to suggest that there's a gap in the history and that we only look at from the period of 181 and then forget about everything until today. One of the pieces that I was tracking in this was sort of what is the language, the development of the language, parallel language in the General Assembly versus the language in the Security Council. And how does that diverge? And how did that come together in the Namibia case to provide a unified framework between these two bodies? And that was one of the pieces that I noted is absent in the Palestinian case. I was trying to highlight that, and that seemed to be a major element that actually crystallized as a result of the 4 advisory opinions, not much on the contentious case, but certainly the 4 advisory opinions in Namibia. And might that be advanced, bringing together these 2 very disparate frameworks that we have so far in the Security Council versus the General Assembly in the Palestine case? How could those be brought together with a legal strategy that uses the ICJ? On the question of UNRWA, I think this addresses both what you've said and Jaber's question about the crisis of UNRWA. On the one hand, UNRWA was established as a temporary agency, and it was very clearly meant to simply allow the refugees to survive while the UNCCP did its work and completed the political part of its mission, which was to bring the 2 sides of the conflict together and then advance the durable solution that was spelled out in paragraph 11, bring it about. And I think our problem now is that what is the alternative to losing UNRWA as the agency with the deepest experience and an agency that's actually driven by the Palestinians themselves? It's unique on the UN agency front in that regard. At the same time, you have in the UNHCR statute only the first sentence of Article 1D, that is the exclusion clause, and not the second sentence, the re-inclusion clause. So there would have to be as well a UN resolution to amend the UNHCR statute to incorporate Palestinians. Right now we have a clear exclusion. There's also an exclusion in the 1952 Convention on the status of stateless persons. Clear exclusion. Again, the first sentence, not the second. So that's a huge lacuna for protection for Palestinians as both stateless people, and then what agency could cover that. At the same time, it's very clear that UNRWA, though it may expand in the area, in certain areas of protection, it clearly has no authority over a durable solution. It cannot, in the state that it is now and in the composition that it is now, take on any responsibility towards the seeking and implementation of durable solutions. So we have these gaps in each one of these critical areas, agencies on the one hand and legal mandates on the other, that somehow have to be resolved. And if you ask me, I wouldn't want to be the one to be bringing some kind of amendment to the UNRWA composition or to UNHCR statute in this state to the UN. I mean, I think there's a very, very real possibility that UNRWA would simply be done away with.
Yes, I would like to add something to what Susan just said regarding UNRWA, and to answer Jaber's question regarding is there something intentional in targeting UNRWA, and will it bear consequences for Palestinian refugees? I think so, but in a way that is probably not intentional, because, okay, first of all, UNRWA financial crisis is something that has existed since the early 50s, and it's a problem that has perpetuated because UNRWA had to face an increasing number of refugees with increasingly shrinking means. Having said that, the recent curtailing of U.S. funds, I don't think they were intended to annihilate the role of UNRWA, because this is something that it's in the interest of no one. Surely it's not something that the host countries would favor. This is not something that Israel itself would favor. At the same time, it's an inconsiderate act which is having enormous repercussions, once again, on the refugees, because UNRWA runs programs that are essential, like health programs, education, relief and social services, especially at the moment like this one, where 80% of the population, the refugee population in Gaza, relies on assistance, on crucial assistance like the one provided by UNRWA, and where UNRWA is facing enormous challenges in one of its field offices, like in Syria. So I think that although not intentional, yes, once again, it will be the Palestinian refugees who will bear the brunt for it. And again, I know that Arab countries have matched, at least for this year, the immediate needs, budgetary needs, but this doesn't help in the long term. And then there are UNRWA colleagues in the room, so I would be happy if they felt like complimenting what I'm saying. One thing regarding UNRWA, UNCCP, UNHCR relationship, I might have a different take on this issue compared to Susan. It's true that when UNRWA was created, there was a specific mandate. It was temporary, but so was initially UNHCR. And the idea was that UNRWA had to provide immediate relief to alleviate the burden over distressed refugees, while a political solution was achieved, and it was supposed to be achieved in the short run under the auspices of the UNCCP. I don't think that there was an intention in the drafters of the various refugee instruments to bifurcate the system, or UNCCP will deal with protection and UNRWA will deal with assistance. Because UNRWA has in fact dealt since the beginning with what is considered today crucial aspects of protection, like delivery of assistance, education and health. What has happened is that the body was mandated to deal with a durable solution of Palestinian refugees, UNCCP has become ineffective, de facto ineffective. And UNRWA has expanded, also thanks to the endorsement of the General Assembly, has expanded its function up to deliver protection on numerous fronts. The fact that there is no durable solution, I don't think that can be can be attributed to the lack of a UN mandate to resolve the question. Again, the question is broader, and it is to be researched in the realm of the political will of the parties who can influence the solution instead of the management of the refugee crisis.
Sure. In response to the question about how long it would take for reparations, I wish I had a crystal ball so I could say how long the process would take. I mean, the process is still ongoing in former apartheid South Africa and also with other situations of refugee reparations. But we still actually have, I know I said that we can start looking at reparations and forming ideas about how reparations should happen so that when the time comes, we are prepared. And that would make a reparations mechanism more effective and then thus, of course, make it happen more quickly. Particularly if we heed the lessons learned from previous reparations mechanisms. But I think also to get to the stage where we can start implementing reparations, there are certain preconditions that have to be fulfilled. And of course, one of them would be the recognition of Israel's historic and continuing role in the augmentation, sustainment of the Palestinian refugee and IDP condition. And for the international community to take the necessary interventions at the very least to halt the ongoing displacement and dispossession, so preventing more and more Palestinians from becoming part of that 67% of the Palestinian population who are already refugees and IDPs and experiencing also secondary and tertiary displacements.
Thank you. Here in the back, yeah. You, yeah.
Oh, do I need to turn? So they can see who you are. With my arm?
It's working. It's working. Shall I proceed? Okay. So I wanted actually to make a brief comment about one of the a question that Jessica had made earlier, and there was an excellent answer for it, but I want to add something to it. In general, Israel, as well as the Zionist movement, usually argues that because there's a difference between the system of refugeehood relating to the Palestinians, the Palestine refugees framework is different from the Refugees Convention of 1951, that this is actually unjust and this is wrong, and this means the way they suggest it is that since people would be more likely to eventually end their refugee status in the 1951 convention, this actually means that everybody is abusing Israel somehow by using the refugees as a weapon against it. Now, I have an additional suggested point to make in this regard, which is that the right of return itself and the reparations are not really related so much to the status of the refugee. Palestine refugees are not entitled to return because they are refugees, but because they have been displaced. And these are two different things. So the reason why Palestinians who were displaced from their homes in 1948 and their descendants, and the reason why also the ongoing Nakba victims of today and the continuing Nakba that continues every day, they also have the same right to reparations, is because when Israel displaced these people, it actually breached international law. And as Lubnah earlier indicated, what the law of state responsibility expects a state that breaches international law to do is to repair all the damage, which includes basically repatriation. So it doesn't matter, and I think this is also important for the Arab states to understand, and everybody else. It doesn't matter if a refugee eventually gets a citizenship abroad, does not get a citizenship abroad. So giving their rights in the different Arab states will not actually undermine the refugee right to return. Actually, on the contrary, it has nothing to do. So whether the Palestinian eventually continues to have a refugee status or not, because they are in the UNRWA mandate, or they left the UNRWA mandate and came here, or went to Chile, or went to other places around the world, doesn't have much to do with the right of return. The right of return is the right of return stems from a different source. Thank you.
Thank you. Phyllis?
Okay. Thank you very much. This has been an extraordinary conversation. I have a question which I think is primarily for Susan, but others may have ideas as well. I'm not going to weigh in on whether Namibia and Palestine are apples and oranges or two different versions of oranges, but there is one way in which I think there is a very strong connection where we can learn something, and that has to do with the role of civil society in making possible those UN resolutions. So I wonder if, Susan, in your research, or if others of you have come across how it was that we managed to get these resolutions. Our colleague from Namibia may have some ideas about this as well. At a time, it was not the same, obviously, as the special relationship that exists between my government and the State of Israel, but it was in the middle of the Cold War, when hostilities and tensions, both inside the Security Council and more broadly in the GA and in the UN as a whole, were very strong. So how was it that we managed to get those important resolutions passed in the Council in the context of that very tense and divided moment? So what are the lessons that civil society can learn about what pressure worked on governments across the world to make that possible? What can we learn from those campaigns?
Should I wait? Oh. Thank you, and thank you for this extraordinary panel. I would also like to note it's very nice to have a panel in which all of the participants are women. I'm Atalia, I'm from Zochot, the organization which was mentioned earlier, and a short comment and two short questions. The short comment is I would like to add to what Jessica said about civic transitional justice mechanisms, is that it actually, the international community, which we talked a lot about in these past 2 days, has also a role in transitional justice mechanisms, not only when talking about official representatives, but also talking about the civic society within the international community. For example, two things we did at Zochot was that in Bet Natif and in Lubnah, to destroy Palestinian villages, the JNF planted a forest. One of them was a forest that was in the memory of a Dutch reverend who saved Jews during the Holocaust, and the other one was planted with the help of contributions from South Africa. And in these two villages, the son of the Reverend actually came and made a public apology, and we made a ceremony about it, and he apologized for the fact that in the memory of his father, a JNF forest was planted on a destroyed Palestinian village, and also in Lubnah, activists from South Africa came and made an apology. So these apologies and these mechanisms can also be taken by civic society within the international community, and I think it's something that's very important to note. Two short questions. One for Jessica. You mentioned that from the settler colonialism perspective, there is some criticism about transitional justice mechanisms. If you could elaborate on that. And another question, both for Jessica and Lubnah. You mentioned that as part of these mechanisms, a mechanism that can be done is a reform in institutions. So I would like to ask, how do you see that in the case of Palestine? What sort of reforms? Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to take one more question from here, and if I could please remind speakers to introduce themselves before posing their questions. And with an eye on the clock, brevity is going to be much appreciated from both questioners and respondents. Thank you.
As soon as we could get the technology to work. Good morning, Itai Epstein for the Norwegian Refugee Council. Thank you, panelists. My question, I'll inspired to be brief, is inspired by the sense that not all is lost. We would all be aware that this morning the Human Rights Council adopted a resolution in relation to recent events in Gaza, calling for dispatching a commission of inquiry. And the U.S. and Australia stood alone in opposing that. So perhaps there is some hope for promoting compliance with international law. My question relates to the relationship between a protracted refugee crisis where neither repatriation or restitution is offered, and the prevention or reduction of statelessness. Israel is state party, both to the 54 Convention on the Status of Stateless Persons, but I think more significantly to the 61 Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness. Could we somehow utilize that framework to promote a durable solution as a bypass to the defunct mechanisms? Thank you.
Thank you. So if panelists would now like to take a brief moment to respond to all those complex questions. Susan, the floor is yours.
So first of all, Munir's question on the right of return doesn't relate to refugees. Actually, I think what the work we've been doing with Badil has been to reinforce that the right of return is such a strong normative obligation that it exists under at least three main bodies of law. So it exists under international humanitarian law, the right of displaced people to return after conflict. It exists as a matter of international human rights law in many different treaties, but obviously emanates from the Universal Declaration and is in prominently the Civil and Political Rights Convention. But it is best understood in terms of its implementation as a matter of refugee law. And I think that's why many of us have tried to reframe the right of return in order to draw parallels from mass refugee flows around the world to show how right of return has been implemented and has become obligatory and normative as a matter of customary international law. Now, that's not to say that it doesn't exist, and I think the point I was trying to make earlier is that if we take the position that Palestinians have had an internationally recognized nationality that is unbroken by an illegal denationalization act of Israeli domestic law, then today we can say that it is as a matter of Palestinian nationals that they have the right to return to their territory. And what's interesting about the Resolution 194 and the mandate of UNCCP is that those referred to the definition of Palestinian refugees as nationals. It was not just Palestinian refugees who were covered by the UNCCP's obligation in paragraph 11's solution, but all of those people who were habitual residents in the territory of Palestine, who claimed their nationality to that 1924 legislation, who were covered and entitled to return, restitution, and compensation. So it is actually, and that's the point I've been trying to make about this crucial distinction between UNRWA-defined refugees and refugees as defined for the durable solution of the United Nations General Assembly that's incorporated in 194. That is a national status. It's not a refugee status. And so whether or not a person can be defined as a refugee outside in the diaspora is not relevant to their claim under 194 to restitution, return, and compensation. That's a really important point. I'm very glad you made it. Phyllis, in terms of the lessons learned for civil society, I did try in my research to track what civil society efforts have been made in all of these different cases. And I think what is remarkable is the gains that civil society have made in the Palestine case through the UN human rights mechanisms. We have actually had some very, very clear, distinct concluding observations from several of the mechanisms, but particularly the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, about there no such thing as Jewish nationality, and that all of the Palestinian rights must be claimed on an equal rights basis. And the pushback against Israel's claim that the human rights treaties end at Israel's supposed borders and don't extend to its obligations to the occupied territories, all of that has been clearly pushed back by the human rights concluding observations and all of the treaty bodies that have addressed it. And this is the work of civil society. I think the BDS campaign that has gained traction all around the world, this is the work of civil society. It's really quite remarkable. Now, in the Namibia case, I think what one of the critical pieces about the Namibia mobilization for sanctions, again, we have BD in the BDS, but we don't have the S yet, because the S takes state action. And that's what's missing in the diplomacy since the statehood recognition, and which needs to happen on a state-by-state basis, because every state that recognizes Palestine, which is now about 70% of the UN membership, every one of those states can be diplomatically engaged for the kinds of sanctions that came out of the final advisory opinion, the 1970 advisory opinion on Namibia, which was the one that triggered the sanctions regime. And which finally, even though the Security Council in Namibia was just as reluctant as the Security Council has been in Palestine to call for sanctions, to declare illegality, because of that last ICJ opinion, the Security Council was forced to come around and recognize the erga omnes obligations, to stop military dealings with South Africa, to reject the credentials of the South African delegation at the UN, to intensify work for sanctions, and then we had in parallel the Namibian Council filing litigation in various courts to protect its interests and resources. And this was the global Namibian movement, not the Namibians inside Namibia.
Very briefly, I apologize because I didn't address the question from the floor regarding the incompatibility between the improvement of living conditions and durable solutions. There is no, in international law, that incompatibility doesn't exist. Actually, for a long time in certain countries, not all, but in certain host countries, the misery of Palestinian refugees has been used to sort of bear testament of Israel's wrongdoings, and this has proven detrimental first and foremost for Palestinian refugees, because helping them to develop and become a self-reliant diaspora would have helped their cause better, I think. But from a human rights point of view, they are entitled to receive respect of their rights. And now it's clear that this is something that both host authorities and Palestinian refugees have come to terms with, and this by no means would undermine their historical claims under Resolution 194 stemming from the law which I mentioned before. Regarding the issue of civil society, I do think that civil society can play a major role in advancing the issue of exposing, bringing forward accountability. The problem, I don't know the case of Namibia, but the problem that the civil society supporting the case of justice accountability in Palestine is facing criminalization in most of the countries, which doesn't help. And so this is something that each country should be aware of. Regarding the question of statelessness, this is a thorny issue, and it's a complex one. In the book I'm writing about Palestinian refugees in international law. You know, I'm trying to unpack it, because this is where probably political and legal considerations have conflated in a way that prevents to have an objective look at the matter. Palestinian refugees, like Susan rightly pointed out, have a particular form of statelessness that comes from the denationalization that they experienced when Israel enacted its nationality law. So they should return as a matter of citizens. This is right. At the same time, the protracted statelessness that they have experienced wherever they have been, with the exception of Jordan and other individual cases, is an issue, not only in terms of protection, because I don't think that the Refugee Convention is less protective than the statelessness framework. Where I think there is a limitation is in, for example, UNHCR is calling to end the stateless campaign in 10 years' time. Doesn't even mention Palestinian refugees, which are the largest stateless group in the world. This is a problem, because like the case of Palestine being examined within the ICC testifies, these issues are important to maintain awareness on the general illegality, a multi-layer illegality experienced by Palestinian refugees. And I think I'm done.
I would like to, before answering to Atalia, I would like to refer that if we expect Israel or the responsibles to take responsibility to acknowledge, and because that is not happening, civil society, we have all this burden, human rights defenders doing all this work that has to be done by more official bodies. And at some point I started to see if there was any case that the UN took responsibility for something wrong or apologized, and I found that it was related to Haiti, to the intervention of the UN in Haiti during the epidemics in the earthquake. I didn't find anything else. Maybe you know more. And I was thinking it could be a good model if at some point the UN, doesn't matter which body, would take responsibility of the impact of the partition plan on the lives of Israelis and Palestinians, or what was the effect of doing something that it was not related to the lives of the people to make a partition. One of the criticisms of transitional justice of settler colonialism to transitional justice relate to ignoring during transitional justice processes, even in South Africa, is ignoring the settler colonialism roots that influence, how Dutch people and the British settled in Africa, and how as what happened in Rwanda, that the conflict between the two groups of people that finish in the genocide is related to settler colonialism. Generally, during transitional justice, it's in a way there is a disconnection of all the effects on the roots of colonialism. I will say something short about institutional reforms. I think again, one of the work being started by Zochrot, taking the curriculum of the history, how we teach history to kids, how we teach civil studies, and try to find cracks in the curriculum, try to say what we don't teach kids, because when you study about the history of Zionism, you never hear about the Nakba and about refugees. So this could be trying to the institution and make a change. Of course, the issue of the army and what Phyllis was referring also to the issue of selling arms, how the structure of Israel as a place that use the occupation as profiting from it and saying what we do is test proven. This could be a structure or an institution that has to be changed. In Northern Ireland, there was not a truth commission process, for example, but there was a change in the army and in the police, capacity building, trainings. So yeah, this would be the main. And of course, what is the mechanism called vetting, that is to take out people that were involved in crimes. You know, that was mainly done after the Soviet Union, to take out people who were involved in human rights violations.
Yeah, and just to complete what Jessica said, we're talking about, of course, all public service institutions, the schools, the way the finances are divided up in Israel, where certain municipalities get more money than other municipalities based on the nature of their residents. And then, of course, there has to be a significant amount of reform within Israeli law, because a lot of the laws in place, like the law of return, the prevention of infiltration law, the permit regime, all these things have to be reformed so that you can create a situation in which you are inclusive and democratic and provide non-discriminatory policies, practices, and institutions.
This is in the case that these are more cosmetic reforms. In the case everything will change and there will be, for example, one state, of course all the institutions has to be revised and transformed.
Thank you. We'll now take a final round of, I hope, short questions with short answers, because we have to conclude, and I'm going to start there in the back. Yes, please. I think you're 1443.
Is this on? Yes. Okay. My name is Priscilla Reed. I'm a member of the general public. Unless I am seriously misunderstanding, an extensive legal framework exists that defends Palestinian rights. And the problem is compliance and therefore enforcement. And I don't think any of us doubts that the major problem of enforcement has to do with the Leviathan in the Security Council, the United States. So I wonder if we have been broaching the subject, I wonder if we could spend some more time talking about what the possibilities are within the global community and specifically within the United Nations for circumventing the United States in getting compliance and enforcement.
Thank you. And Namibia, is that you? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I don't really want to ask a question. I just had a couple of comments. And first of all, I wanted to say this has been one of the most interesting discussions I've ever attended on this question of Palestine, simply because it speaks so deeply to the question of nationality, statehood, and the mismatch between the legal frameworks and what is actually happening on the ground. I also thought it was very interesting to hear about, things that have happened to those that have stood up for rights. Those are things that we all went through in countries like Namibia, South Africa, and so on, where if you dared to speak out, obviously, if you were white, you were going to be targeted by whites. If you were black, it just depended on where you were in the society and so on. And that's why a lot of people went into exile. I thought that was very interesting also from the point of view of looking at how there's the thing of nationhood of the Palestinians versus nationhood of the Israelis and not Jews, because that should be different. You cannot be a member of a country based on your religion. And I think this is where there has been a huge issue. And it's been a huge, it's been misused and propagandized to such an amazing extent that sometimes it just blows my mind when people just completely misunderstand this whole thing. So I really would like to see in the future that we focus more on the statehood question, just in terms of taking this thing forward. And also what has been shocking again, of course we know these things, but what has been shocking is how the Palestinian refugee question has been so sidelined and not really addressed. So I just want to thank the panel members and also the organizers for raising these issues through this panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're oversubscribed, and the last question will be from the gentleman in the front.
Yes, my name is Don Lars Sanders. I'm a child of the civil rights movement right here in America. I have a lot of experience with racial situations. We all saw this coming, okay? The move from Tel Aviv embassy to Jerusalem. We all saw this slaughter coming. Many countries asked not to move the embassy. But due to racial tension, the embassy was moved anyway. Now the question is, how do we stop the bloodshed? As long as that embassy remains open, the bloodshed is going to continue. The American embassy needs to be shut down immediately and start dialogue properly between the Palestinians and the Jewish people. And once we solve that problem, there will be no crisis with refugees. This is a problem that has spread all over Africa, the Middle East. You know, whose side you on? I got all the money from America. You know what I'm saying? This is just adding fuel and jealousy from one tribe to the other. Once the problem is solved in Jerusalem with the Palestinians, peace will come. So why do we fool ourselves? Human rights, this and that. Shut the embassy down. Start over. Thank you, and have a blessed day.
Thank you. I'll now ask each of the panelists to briefly respond. I'll begin with Lubnah this time.
There are other options besides the UN. I mean, we did mention the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement with regards to civil society, but there's also the prospect of universal jurisdiction where states can take the initiative and prosecute those who are suspect of human rights violations and crimes. With regards to what Mr. Sanders said about the U.S. Embassy, that is more of a symptom of the situation in Palestine, and I believe Francesca said the management of the question of Palestine rather than the looking for durable solutions or resolutions to the question of Palestine. And so the management of the question of Palestine is what are the characteristics? We see, of course, increased and more serious human rights violations and crimes. We see the ongoing impunity for Israel. We see the degradation of any type of peace process. We see increased displacement and dispossession, and an all-around situation that is not conducive to resolving the situation. And this is brought about by having a humanitarian and a development approach to the conflict rather than a human rights-based approach to the conflict that would provide durable solutions.
Thank you.
I would like to say that it's important to be prepared because at some point the occupation will collapse. The structure we know for several other experiences in the world, who would say that the apartheid in South Africa would collapse, and it happened. So at some point, we think it's forever, but so we have to be prepared and have the tools, because this is not going to be for long.
Thank you.
The question of the Leviathan and how to ensure protection of Palestinian refugees at large. Again, I would like to emphasize that when it comes to Palestinian refugees, there are Israel's responsibilities and there are other countries, host countries' responsibilities. And it's clear that Palestinian refugees have experienced discrimination level, an even level of discriminations wherever they are. Europe, North America, and the Arab region. And human rights treaty bodies have been very meticulous in pointing and recommending ways to address the discrimination. So a first way, probably an easier way to address the issue of protection of Palestinian refugees start from easier countries who are naturally more inclined to solidarity with the Palestinians. When it comes to Israel, once again, I would like to recall the advisory opinion that the ICJ rendered in 2004, because it states many important principles, but one strikes me as important here, and it's the responsibility of erga omnes that is triggered by the level and intensity of violations that Palestinian suffers under the Israeli occupation. Because of those responsibilities entail being erga omnes, the entire international community, there are certain things that each country, all countries are due to do. And an obvious one is to desist from providing assistance and aid to the state which is in violation of norms erga omnes, which is not very different from what civil society is trying to do. So this is another important issue that, based on the existing legal framework, can be leveraged. Thank you.
I'm glad that Francesca raised the ICJ opinion, because I think that the ICJ, for the first time in the Palestine-Israel conflict, in its only opinion, actually settled some of the most contentious underlying questions even doing it in the context of addressing the question of the legality of the wall. So I would say what we need to do collectively is to take that opinion and run with it. It had some very important points about the obligations of the international community of states that need to be furthered, both as a matter of PLO diplomatic relations, one by one, to begin to trigger a sanctions regime, and also for civil society mobilization to trigger the S in the BDS. And I think that is really the biggest lesson of Namibia, because it shouldn't be forgotten that South Africa was the dissenter all the way through at the United Nations, and the U.S. was not in favor at all of sanctions. And it was, again, that final advisory opinion in which it was clear that sanctions were required that finally beat the United States over the head to join the sanctions regime. We have, in many ways, the parallel here in the Palestinian case, with the U.S. basically the main rejectionist state. But the world can work around the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. Before returning the microphone to the chair, I'd just also like to thank all four panelists for leading and provoking such a rich and interesting discussion, and to you for your questions and your patience. Excellency?
Thank you very much, moderator. And I just would also like to second the moderator in thanking the panelists. I think we have learned quite a lot today, lesson learned from past practices. It's quite an interesting morning, and I think this is also in line with the discussion that we have had yesterday. So the question is still there. The question of Palestine is an important global issue that I think we cannot afford to forget, and I think we should continue to bring forward solution. I will not give a summing up, noting the time, but once again to appeal to colleagues to come at 3 p.m. once again after lunch, where we will reconvene for the fourth and final panel discussion, which is entitled Ways Forward to Achieve a Sustainable Peace. I think this is sort of a wrapping up of all the discussion that we had in the last three panels. So once again, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, maybe a round of applause for the panelists in front of us that have been doing an excellent job. And with that, I would like to adjourn for lunch and once again reconvene at 3 p.m. And for those that are not having lunch, Ramadan Mubarak. Meeting is suspended. Thank you so much.